Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome back to another 1/18 scale model car review of this. From the 2010 Formula One World Championship, the Red Bull RB6, rendered in 1/18 scale by Mini Champs. The RB6. It is the beginning of one of the more dominant eras in recent Formula One history. Of course, the dominance of Red Bull from 2010 to 2013. It was our first taste of things that were to come later on in the 2010s decade, namely beginning in 2014 with Mercedes. However, before we had the dominance of Mercedes, we had the dominance of Red Bull and their star driver, Sebastian Vettel. With Sebastian Vettel's recent announcement that he will retire from Formula One at the end of the 2022 season, I thought it would be appropriate to take a look at my model of the car with which he won his first Drivers' World Championship in 2010, the Red Bull RB6. This car, quite dominant in its competition history, as we shall delve into in the minutes to come. However, it's also very indicative of the great design genius that is Adrian Newey and the Red Bull brain trust of the early part of the 2010s decade. This car took the technical regulations by storm and exploited everything that they had to offer, conspiring to create a car that was incredibly dominant for its time, and still, even to this day, when we compare it to the pantheon of overall dominant Formula One cars, the Red Bull RB6 does rank up there rather highly, as we shall discuss. But this 1/18 scale car by Mini Champs, great addition to my collection. I have had this one for a great number of years, and it's also a limited edition car. This is one of 7,500 for the entire world. It is patterned after the spec of the car as it appeared at the 2010 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. So you will see some unique sponsorship on this one that was seen only in Abu Dhabi. And additionally, you will see Sebastian Vettel's multicolored, highly reflective helmet that he ran only at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. And of course, the design of that helmet has since been immortalized by all of the highlight reels from the onboard camera shots that were taking a look at Mr. Vettel in the cockpit as he was on the way to winning his first Drivers' World Championship, his first of 4 championships. The statistics say that Sebastian Vettel is one of the greats, one of the greatest, actually, ever to drive a Formula One car. And 4 World Championships, not too many other people have done that. So sit back, relax, and let's take a look at this 1/18 scale version of Sebastian Vettel's first World Championship winning Formula One car, the Red Bull RB6.
The Red Bull RB6 from the 2010 championship. 2010 now feels like it was quite some time ago, well, because the calendar says it was 12 years ago. That is a little bit of a brain blast to me because I well remember the 2010 season. I well remember this car competing, and of course I well remember the heart-stopping season finale that we got that year at Abu Dhabi, which culminated in Sebastian Vettel becoming world champion for the first time. What was this car? What is its competition history? And what are some little tidbits of information about its design? Well, it is, of course, the Red Bull RB6, which is the Formula One car designed and fielded by Red Bull for the 2010 World Championship. It was designed in principle by the great Adrian Newey, acting as Chief Technical Officer for Red Bull Technologies. Adrian Newey, of course, we don't really need to give him an introduction. He is one of the most successful Grand Prix car designers ever, having penned the lines of many a World Championship winning car in both the drivers and constructors categories for about the last 30-35 years now. His pedigree goes back really with March and Leighton House in the late 80s and early 90s, and before that he even had a foray into designing cars for the Indy 500. But he's really well known for his designs on the Williams cars of the early 90s, in particular FW14, FW14B, FW15, and 15A, B, and C, of course. Those were all incredibly dominant race cars. He had a spell with McLaren. He designed the great McLaren MP420, which unfortunately wasn't quite enough to win the World Championship, although it had plenty of pace in reserve to do so. And then he moved over to Red Bull, and the early part of the 2010s decade, definitely he stamped his mark of authority all over that, winning the Constructors' Championship with Red Bull in 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013. And of course, in more recent times, he's won another Drivers' Championship with Max Verstappen in 2021. However, 2010, what was this year like? What is this car? Why was it so successful? Well, Additionally, on the Red Bull Technologies Brain Trust staff list, we also have guys like Rob Marshall, Dave Warner, Mark Ellis, Andrew Green, Giles Wood, Peter Prodromo, and Dan Fallow. So we do have some names here that are recognizable, of course, if you are a fan of Formula One. And of course, all of these guys conspired to create the RB6. The immediate predecessor of this car, and probably the car that was responsible for being the genesis of the technologies and overall design philosophy that we see on the RB6, was the RB5, and there are a couple of things on the RB5 that will come into play here in our assessment of the RB6. However, this car here is pretty different overall in terms of what they're doing with the aerodynamics, particularly in the rear end, relative to its successor, the RB7. So this car is a carryover evolution, if you like, of the RB5. However, it's kind of a primordial ooze, but not entirely related to the car that immediately succeeded it. Such is the creativity of Adrian Newey, and such was the creativity of the interpretation of the technical regulations in this era. Context on this, 2009 we had a radical shakeup in the technical regulations which yielded this overall aerodynamic philosophy with the low and wide front wings and the tall and narrow rear wings. However, this was only the second year of that overall regulations package, and even in 2010 we had more radical changes to it. 2010 we had a formal banning of refueling, meaning that you cannot refuel the car during the Grand Prix, so the cars necessarily needed to become longer to accommodate a larger fuel tank to give them that range necessary to complete a Grand Prix distance on a single load of fuel. So these cars are even markedly different to 2009. So really we had 2 years in succession with radical regulation changes, the overall aerodynamic changes in 2009, and then 2010 with more focus on the chassis side, with predominantly banning refueling is what dictated the overall size and architecture of these cars. Technically speaking, though, what have we on this car? Well, from 2010, you would expect carbon fiber everywhere, and indeed we do have carbon fiber everywhere. Carbon fiber honeycomb composite monocoque, which is the principal chassis structure of the car that incorporates the cockpit, the overall survival cell. It also incorporates things like mounts for the fuel tank and engine mounts, and of course your suspension mounts, at least on the front end anyway, are going through that carbon fiber monocoque. So that is the structural core of the car, and it is just as sophisticated as you would expect on a car of 2022 vintage. On the suspension side, what do we have here? We have got our pushrod suspension in the front, double wishbone pushrod, carbon suspension members, of course, in the upper and lower wishbones, and of course the pushrods are also shrouded in carbon at very least. They go up into dampers mounted on the top of the chassis there, and you'll be able to see little bulges on the front end of the monocoque there to accommodate some of those dampers. The rear suspension, though, it is effectively the same arrangement, but has been flipped over by 180 degrees. We have a pull rod rear suspension on this car, and that pull rod rear suspension was something that Red Bull ultimately would use to great effect in their dominant stream of World Championship wins from 2010 through 2013. So pull rod on this car and pull rod on all the cars that succeeded it up through the 2013 World Championship. Driving this beast, we have got the Renault RS27-2010 engine. The engine specification in Formula One was frozen at the end of the 2006 season, so we've got the 2.4-liter naturally aspirated V8 in this era. However, what you had at the end of 2006 was really all you got through the end of the V8 era going to 2013. Some minor modifications and updates were allowed from time to time in this era, namely in the name of reliability. However, it's a 2.4-liter V8 at a 90-degree bank angle, mounted longitudinally as a stressed member in the chassis. The 2010 regulations stipulated an 18,000 RPM rev limit on all of the Formula One engines. The engines could rev higher, and they did rev higher in their 2006 specifications across the board. However, for 2007 we had a 19,000 rev limit, and then by 2009 that came down to 18,000 revs, and that's where it remained through the end of the V8 era at the end of the 2013 season. That engine is mated to, of course, a transmission. We have got the principal gearbox on the car, which is a 7-speed semi-automatic paddle shift unit. This was ubiquitous up and down the field. Everybody ran a 7-speed unit all with that electro-hydraulic sequential actuation. So the days of the 3 pedals and a stick were long gone by this point in Formula One. That ended really in 1996. So everybody with a semi-automatic transmission, that was also something that Adrian Newey was intimately involved with in terms of the implementation of that technology with Williams in the early 90s. He wasn't responsible for bringing it to Formula One. That honor goes to John Barnard and Ferrari in 1989. However, Adrian Newey was the first designer who really made it work and turned that into a Constructors' Championship winning combination. Overall, the power on this car, the engine is putting out in excess of 750 horsepower. Estimates in the era I remember put it anywhere between 780 and 810 to 820 horsepower. So we could say conservatively about 770, 780 horsepower out of that 2.4-liter Renault engine. Overall weight here, including the driver but not including fluids and fuel, 620 kilograms. So that's a good deal lighter than the current Formula One cars, which are north of 700 by a long way. And of course, when you start to add fuel, you start to push 900 kilos at the start of the race, which I say is far from ideal. However, that's some pontification for a different day. Total was providing the fuel for that Renault engine for Red Bull in this era. And of course, the tires on this car, they're 13-inch wheels and they are wrapped with Bridgestone Potenza rubber. So 2010, we had Bridgestone as the sole tire supplier in Formula One, and 2010 happened to be the last season for which Bridgestone was involved in Formula One. Of course, they were succeeded by Pirelli beginning in 2011, and Pirelli continues to this day to be Formula One's sole tire supplier. Competition history on the RB6 reads a little bit something like this. It was only entered by Red Bull Racing in the 2010 World Championship. It was driven by Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber. There were no other drivers who deputized for each other during the 2010 season for Red Bull. The car made its debut at the 2010 Bahrain Grand Prix, which, if those of you remember that race, you will remember that it was not raced on any layout of the Bahrain International Circuit that we have seen subsequently. It was run on the endurance layout, which is an extended Sector 2, basically, and, well, it was kind of a flop. We have had other alternate configurations of Bahrain featuring in the World Championship since, notably in 2020 when we had the Sahir Grand Prix, as it was effectively called. We had the outer circuit, which was like a 55-second lap, and it was a little bit crazy. But here we were running the endurance layout, and it was a flop. Nobody much liked it, and it hasn't since returned to the World Championship. However, this car started 19 races. It won 9 of them. It scored 20 total podium finishes. It scored 15 pole positions and 6 fastest laps. Very dominant indeed. It won the Constructors' Championship in 2010, which was the first for Red Bull, and it won the Drivers' Championship as well, which was the first of 4 for Sebastian Vettel. So this is certainly one of the most dominant cars in Grand Prix history. It doesn't stack up at the very top in terms of the upper echelon of overall dominance. The McLaren MP44 still unchallenged in that regard. However, we've got cars like the Mercedes W10 and W11, which came mighty close to those records. So this car definitely very high in the pantheon of overall success rates in Formula One. Not the overall top, but it's certainly one that deserved the World Championships that it was bestowed at the end of the season. And of course, it's the car that launched the really legendary career of its driver, Sebastian Vettel. He was not the favorite for the title going into the final round of the championship. There were still 5 drivers mathematically alive going in to the start of the race at Abu Dhabi, but at the end, we had Ferrari strategy calls, which kind of wrecked things for Fernando Alonso. Mark Webber was a little bit of a long shot for the title, but he was still mathematically alive. However, Sebastian Vettel just coming home where he needed to be. Everybody else shook out behind him, and his race engineer over the radio, after Vettel had long crossed the line, finally was able to scream Weltmeister at the end. World champion Sebastian Vettel 2010. Stopping our rotation here, and let's start to take a closer look at what we've got here technically on the RB6 as we zoom in a little bit here. First off, I just want to point out the front wing here on this car and the overall front end of the monocoque in general. 2010, it was the second year for this design of front end in Formula One. Gone were the very complicated but somewhat narrow front wings on Formula One cars. This was done partially as you could say a cost-saving measure in terms of trying to cut down on the complexity of the wings, but the teams very quickly circumvented that with loophole exploitation. However, the other rationale for this was attempting to improve overtaking because they were trying to give these wings a little bit more cross-sectional area in terms of the amount of air that they could scoop up and manipulate. So they were hoping that these wings would be able to cut through the turbulence generated by a car in front a little bit better. Ultimately, it didn't work at all to that effect. Somewhat because they really didn't address the fundamental issue of why the cars couldn't follow, which was really what was going on at the rear end of the car in terms of how the car in front was treating the air, but also because the designers were exploiting little irregularities and loopholes in the regulations to generate things like outwash. What we mean by outwash is we are trying to take air and steer it around the front axle because you've got these big wheels and tires out here in the airstream, which are generating a lot of turbulence and therefore drag. So if you can get that high-speed, high-pressure flow away from that front axle, you can cut down on the amount of drag that you generate for yourself. However, you're going to generate a lot of turbulence in your wake, which is not at all good for the guy who's trying to follow you. However, we see this rather intricate design on the end fences of these front wings in this era, and that is designed to generate that outwash. We've got an inverted U-channel down here, which is a vortex generator. We're trying to steer that vortex around the front axle. We've also got other louvers and winglets here in an attempt to spill some of that air outboard away from the car in general. So that's why you've got these little strakes and louvers and things cut into these front wings in the end fence area, and of course that's what they're trying to do. Additionally, on the wing though, you can see that the overall profile of the main plane is pretty quiet, relatively flat, and it's entirely flat across this center section here, 300 millimeters across. That's homologated in the regulations for this time period. However, we've got ourselves flaps on the outboard edges of the wings here. That's where the designers were allowed to play. Another thing that you'll see in terms of the wing mounting solution, we've got these two rather long pylons that are attached to the underside of the nose, and that of course is bringing the wing down to the maximum wing height that is permitted, and really they wanted to get the wing as low as they could in terms of getting it close to the ground, because the faster you can accelerate air through a gap, meaning if you can get a smaller gap to accelerate air through, the faster it goes, the lower its pressure, and because we're trying to generate downforce rather than lift, you get a negative lift, which means a downforce, and more downforce on the front end means better grip through high-speed corners, which means better performance overall in your lap time. Another thing that was interesting about the nose section on this car, and of course this model being a die-cast model, we can't illustrate this at all, but there is footage from the 2010 season of Red Bull pit stops, particularly when they had to do a front wing change, which of course would entail removing the entire nose section of the car, front wing included, and then they would just fit a new one onto the front of the monocoque. This nose was flexible. And it was flexible for a couple of reasons. One, you want some flex involved in terms of any sort of load-bearing structure, just generally in engineering, because if it doesn't have any sort of give, it's just going to shatter when it becomes overstressed. So rather than having it deflect a little bit, if it just shatters, you get a catastrophic failure right away, and that's no good. So have it a little bit flexible, give it some give so that you can at least have some window where you can operate this thing, maybe a little bit above its overall limits. But the other thing that Red Bull were doing, and a few other teams were doing in this era as well, and really started to come to a head in 2011, they were flexing not only the front wing, but they were also flexing the nose a little bit. So as the downforce increased across this wing, you would get the outer edges of the wings flexing downward toward the bottom of the ground here. They would start to, even in some cases, spark along the surface of the racetrack. But you would also get flexing of the nose here just to bring the angle of attack up a little bit on the wing so that you get a torsion effect through the wing, which would mean that you're going to generate more downforce at your highest speed. More drag, of course, but through high-speed corners, you want all of the downforce that you can get, and that's exactly what they were doing here on the RB6, and we saw this on the RB7 as well, and the Ferrari F-150, and we had lots of flexi-wing controversies going on in this era, but overall, that's what they were doing on the front wing and front nose treatment areas on these cars. Pulling rearward a little bit, you can see we've got our front suspension, the double wishbone push rod, and just below that, our angle doesn't quite allow it, but we have got cape winglets down there in this section on either side of the center line of the car as well. But our suspension arrangement here, wishbone, wishbone, and then push rod through here, and then of course we've got our track rod for the steering, which obviously works on this model. Very, very cool. If we pull upward again, you can see the top end of the monocoque. We have got these two little bulges here. These serve a dual purpose. They're obviously fairings for the dampers, which don't quite fit inside the confines of the monocoque itself, but they also create this channel through which we can send air toward the cockpit and therefore toward the air intake snorkel for the engine there in the roll structure. So that's why we have got this. We saw a couple of teams trialing things like this in 2009, I recall. Even Braun trialed a design like this in 2009. Ultimately, for 2010, the Mercedes, the Mercedes team, they bought out the Braun team at the end of 2009, so that car really is the successor to the BGP 001, the Mercedes W01. They did run something like this as well, but obviously Red Bull are using this to try and accelerate some air through the cockpit area and then starting to feed the snorkel through there. So that's cool. Midships on the car, and then starting to look aft, we have got ourselves the side pods here. You'll notice these side pods are a stark contrast to what you got toward the end of 2006 through 2008, where we had flow modifiers all over the place, little turning vanes and flick-ups everywhere, just trying to generate a little bit more downforce here and there. Very quiet and clean contiguous lines on the side pods in this era. This was something that was mandated starting in 2009, trying to clean up the midships airflow on these cars, again in an attempt to cut down on the turbulent air in the wakes of these cars. Didn't work, but it is something that we still do see today on Formula One cars, this overall side pod design in terms of things being elongated, as narrow as possible, of course, for packaging, because you want good flow around the floor and toward the top side of the diffuser, but this very clean and quiet bodywork design, just trying to smooth air out toward the rear zone, trying to cut down on turbulent flow. Probably can't see it all that well from this particular vantage point, but we have got ourselves here our rear suspension, which is the same as the front. However, it's just been rotated 180 degrees. It's now upside down relative to the front, which means that we've got ourselves a pull rod rear suspension. And this was done basically for packaging purposes here. The dampers that are mounted on top of the monocoque, where the front suspension mounts in, they are mounted below the gearbox casing here on the rear suspension. So not the best in terms of the mechanics, just who are trying to work on the car, but we do have the good packaging there for aerodynamic purposes. You want to keep things as narrow as possible down here so you can maximize the airflow, but you also want the heavier components like your dampers as low in the car as possible for better center of gravity, which just lends itself to some better chassis dynamics. Lower center of gravity, you have a lower heave moment and a lower roll moment in the car, which means that you're going to get better cornering response, which ultimately means better lap time. So that's what we are doing here on RB6 in a nutshell in terms of our overall aerodynamic and chassis design philosophy. Of course, there's more going on, which we shall take a look at presently. Taking a look square on from the front end of RB6 just to highlight that overall shape and configuration of that front wing. You can see how low it is and how wide it is. Again, this is something that started in 2009, but you can see where the designers do start to play on the wing right here in terms of the end fences, right in this area here, the outboard flaps on the wing. We can see on this particular wing, we've got 3 closed elements on the principal flap. So we've got 1, 2, 3 right here, and the top edge of that flap is right here. And then we have got these cascade elements, as we called them in this era. We have got 2 closed elements principally, 1 and 2, and then we have got an auxiliary winglet here, and then another little flick up here, and then we get into our end fence in this area. So cool, with our vortex generators outboard, and we've actually got one inboard as well, and obviously that's duplicated on the other side of the wing. Additionally, there is that neutral center section there, 300 millimeters across. The FIA said, no, you shall not play in this area, Mr. Aerodynamicist, whatever. However, below that, in the center line of the car, below the nose cone, you can just see this big empty section, and that is designed to scoop up air that hasn't been manipulated by the wing and start to feed the center line of the car through the cape winglets underneath the nose that we can't quite see here, but they're in this area. And then they will then in turn steer the air toward the small vestigial barge boards that still did exist in this era. The 2009 regulations did not quite succeed in banning barge boards entirely, so the teams still ran them to the extent that they could, and therefore they're here on RB6. Moving up, though, toward the centerline top side, we have got the cockpit area, quite obviously. And in addition to that, you can see there we have our bulges here, shrouding the dampers, and then of course you can see the channel that creates as we head toward the cockpit. Driver's head obviously in that area, but the air snorkel on top for your engine intake, that's where we're starting to steer that air, and we're actually using the driver's helmet to an extent to try and steer that air toward the snorkel for the air intake for the engine. And the better air you can get into the engine in terms of how smooth it is, you want more of a laminar flow headed into the intake for the engine so that you get more consistent volume of intake charge. The more air you throw into anything that's burning, in this case we're burning gasoline at very high speed and pressure, the more efficiently it's going to burn, the hotter it's going to burn, the more completely it's going to burn that fuel. And the more completely you burn that fuel means the more power that you're going to get out of a given volume of fuel that you set alight in the combustion chambers to the tune of 8. So obviously you want airflow into the engine. You want to get that as consistent and as clean as possible. Additionally, the cleaner you can keep your topside flow around the midline of the car, the cleaner it's going to interface the rear wing. And the rear wings in this era, they were cut down a lot relative to what they had been by the end of 2008. However, still, of course, very important for the aerodynamic balance of the car, generating a lot of downforce still, but not quite as much as they once did, simply because the wings are smaller. But they're a bit higher up than they were, which means they are going to get cleaner flow overall. And of course, we had some trickery as well going on with the rear wings in this era. We did not have DRS yet. That wouldn't come until 2011. But we did have some things going on with these rear wings, which of course we shall get into. But overall, just generally from the front end, you can see what a clean and tidy and well-packaged design this RB6 is. It's quite a ways removed from the cars that preceded it, even by a couple of years. Again, the philosophy had shifted to a point where no longer are we just trying to manipulate the air wherever we contacted it. Rather, we are treating the car as a complete package in terms of what is the air doing from the moment it contacts the front wing to the moment it is shot out the back, be it through the gap between the beam wing and the main plane of the rear wing, or through the underside and the diffuser. And of course, Adrian Newey, thinking like a chunk of air, as he often does, was certainly very effective in his assessment of what that air needed to be doing. From the right flank of RB6, what have we going on here? Really, what you're able to see from this angle is just more of a generalized plan in terms of what they are doing overall on the car. Starting with the front end and the front wing, you can see quite clearly now the gaps between the elements of the end fence there. Again, we're just trying to spill overpressure out of this front wing so we don't stall the wing or get undue turbulence, which is going to negate its overall aerodynamic effectiveness for the purpose it was designed. But in addition, you're generating outwash through that, so the airflow is going to come outboard toward where we are around the front end, as the forward momentum of the car through the rest of the overall chunk of air we're going through is going to push it back. So that's the outwash going on there with the front wing end fence. Overall on the front end though, here is our front axle with our wheel and tire assembly right here. Remember, 13-inch wheels in this era, and of course we've got ourselves the Bridgestone Potenza tires, but there we go. Nice wheel. Nothing particularly special here in terms of the wheel design. We're not blowing anything out of the wheel. We don't have wheel fairings or other covers here, just an open traditional wheel design, but nicely rendered here. There was some work done on the wheel nuts in this era because we had lost refueling in the pit stop, so rather than our pit stops taking anywhere between 6 and 10 seconds, depending on how much fuel we were putting in the car in the stop, now the only thing we needed to do in the pit stop was change the tires. So this meant that we were going to have pit stops which in theory could be only as long as it took to swap 4 wheels and tires, which could be done in a matter of 2 to 3 seconds rather than 7 to 10 seconds when we had to wait for the refueling to finish. So the wheel nuts were shaved down a bit to allow the sockets and wheel guns to get over and around them a little bit more quickly and cleanly, and also there was work done on the thread patterns on the wheel nuts to reduce the number of rotations that it took to get them completely tight. So we had pit stop times under 3 seconds beginning in this era, and really Formula One pit stops nowadays, they would be able to do, in some cases, sub 2-second pit stops. In other words, the car is only stationary for about 2 seconds to change all 4 wheels and tires, and of course we got the car being jacked up and then lowered again. Yeah, so things started to get a little bit crazy in terms of the overall time it took to do a pit stop in this era. The FIA have since stepped in and said, well, we actually want you to slow this down a little bit because it's just a little bit dangerous. And we've seen some accidents in the pit stops because the teams are rushing. I remember in 2018, Kimi Räikkönen inadvertently running over one of his mechanics on the rear end as he was leaving the pit lane. Unfortunately, broke the poor mechanic's leg. Because he was in the way of the left rear wheel as Räikkönen was pulling away, and it just didn't end well that day. So the FIA have since stepped in, but the pit stops very fast beginning in this era. Moving rearward, though, going into really the center part of the monocoque, we can see what's going on aerodynamically. Down here we've got our T-tray. We've got our center stay just to cut down on the T-tray flexing too much. And then we have got the tub starting to come in here, as well as the barge board coming in with its little stay, and then just a single solitary turning vane here with Sebastian Vettel's number 5 on it. Yeah, that's about it in terms of the aerodynamic treatment going on here macrocosmically in terms of carbon bodywork elements that we have. Obviously, again, we're not just trying to use each individual element to create an aerodynamic effect. We're treating this whole area as a package deal. So from the time that the air contacts the front wing and the nose assembly to the time it gets here, we are directing it in a given manner so that it will attach itself to the floor and then feed the top side of the diffuser. Also, we're directing a good deal of this air underneath the car, and you can see the gap here that goes under the entire car. That is a gap where we can exploit Bernoulli's principle to accelerate the flow through a constriction and then ultimately blow it out the back where the diffuser is. Looking at the side pod assembly here, though, what do we have? We have just got this smooth contiguous curve going all the way down to the inboard side of the car right through here in the center section, where we're going to start to blend it with a little bit of exhaust flow, as you can see here. Detail is not all that great in terms of being able to see where the exhausts actually are, but the exhaust outlets are right in here. Adrian Newey called this side exhaust. I'm not entirely sure if you really could call it side exhaust or is it more a centerline exhaust, but whatever, he called it side exhaust. And what we're doing here is we are using energized flow from the exhaust, generated by the engine of course, and the exhaust velocity and exhaust volume is not going to be particularly consistent at all times because the engine obviously is changing speed relative to what the car is doing in terms of its speed over ground. And obviously the engine speed will change depending on the gear that you're in as well. However, through your high-speed corners, where your revs are going to be reasonably high in 6th or 7th gear in this case, you're going to have a lot of volume going through the engine in terms of air going through the engine. And this volume that's being shot out the back through the exhaust system can be used to energize the flow going through the diffuser. It's not so much that the exhaust flow directly goes through the diffuser. It does, but the amount of volume going through the engine and going through the exhaust, therefore, is very small compared to the rest of the volume of the atmosphere that the car is driving through. So what we're doing with this is we are just trying to use Bernoulli's principle to energize a flow with a high-speed, high-pressure flow from the exhaust, and then we're going to get entrainment of the surrounding air. We're going to energize all of the air in the rear zone thereby, and therefore we're going to increase the velocity of the entire air mass going through the diffuser, which means a lower pressure exerted on that adjacent surface, which is going to mean downforce as far as we're concerned on the underside of the car. Rear axle, there's our rear wheel and tire assembly. You can see inside the rear wheel here, again, very nice detail. And of course we have got the brake disc and brake caliper in there. Not particularly well detailed in terms of surface detail on the brake disc itself, but you can see that there is a brake disc and a caliper in there on the rear of the car. Very nice. Also very nice tire sidewall detailing there, Bridgestone Potenza, and of course we had the green sidewalls on the tires in this era as well. Moving up, rear wing, Big end fences on the rear wings in this era. Of course, we've got this one adorned with the Red Bull Cola branding here. Of course, Red Bull owning the team, owning the car, and of course owning the big drinks company that finances all of it. Why not add a little bit more advertising space for the company that you already own? So there it is. The Red Bull cars definitely branded with the drinks company logos and the sponsor lettering and all of that. Additionally to that, though, we have got some obligatory Renault branding. Obviously, Renault producing the engine that is underneath all of this bodywork and powering this whole outfit, so cool. And of course, we have got the giant Red Bull, as you can see here. However, all of this sponsor graphic, it is, well, it's affixed to this huge structure right here. What is this? It's non-structural to the car. This is not required to keep the car held together by any means. But what is this? It is a big shark fin, as we called these things in this era. The shark fins, they started to come about in 2008. I remember Renault, I believe, were the first team to use a shark fin on a Formula One car, and they were not contiguous. They did not attach from the snorkel, as you can see here, and attach to the main plane of the rear wing as this one does. They just terminated roughly in this area, and they were just there to control lateral force on the car aerodynamically, just to add a little bit more stability as the cars were going through high-speed corners, just to help the rear end sit a little bit more. And that's generally what was going on in this era as well. But we've linked the shark fin to the end, to the main plane of the rear wing here. That's not just to isolate the two sides of the wing in terms of lateral flow as we're going through a corner. The shark fins also housed something rather interesting. And in order to understand all of that, we need to think about the cockpit area, and we need to think about what's in the cockpit in terms of we have a human being in the cockpit, right? He can't just drive the car, right? That would be too simple for Formula One. He also needs to become an active aerodynamic element of how the car is functioning. And we're not just talking about the position of his head and helmet. No, we're talking about what the driver can do with his limbs, in addition to operating the throttle and brake and the steering wheel and all of that stuff that a driver normally does. He's also going to be using a free hand to manipulate the aerodynamic properties of the car. And that's working in conjunction with what's going on inside this shark fin and what's going on inside the rear wing. Some interesting things were done in this era, but we will get back to that. Now taking a look at the rear zone on RB6, and what do we see here? Well, we see what you would expect to see in the rear zone of a 2010s era Formula One car. We don't have all that much going on here in terms of winglet activity, but we do have a lot going on here in terms of aerodynamic manipulation. First of all, topside, you can see now the overall effect of having these side pods just being rather low and very clean in terms of their lines. They are just sending undisturbed flow, channeling it from the midline section of the car with this hump here to accommodate the engine and gearbox, but we have got now this channel that's created by having this low and flat and clean side of the side pod here on the top side of that bodywork there, and we're just channeling it inboard toward the gap between the beam wing right here and the main plane of that rear wing. So you can see as we accelerate this flow down, we're going to be energizing all of the air that's coming in and just blowing it out through this gap between the main plane and the beam wing in the rear wing assembly. Additionally, what we have going on here, if we move up a little bit, you can see it a little bit more clearly. We have got an outlet here for some engine cooling, but predominantly a gearbox radiator would be behind here inside the top section of the engine cover, and then that would be blown out through the back here as well, also through this gap between the elements of the rear wing. Additionally, though, you're going to see this outlet right here. What is this? This has nothing to do with cooling. This is strictly an aerodynamic aperture. What's happening here? Well, inside the shark fin, if we go all the way up, you can see the top surface now of the shark fin. It's just very thin, and it's just contiguous all the way down to the main plane on this rear wing. Inside this shark fin was a duct. And in 2010, in preseason testing during a shakedown run, we saw McLaren run a continuous shark fin on the engine cover, which, alright, wasn't particularly interesting, but we saw a picture of their rear wing without the shark fin installed, and their rear wing had a hole in it where it interfaces with the shark fin. The McLarens of this era, they were sponsored predominantly by Vodafone, a mobile phone telecommunication service provider. And on their rear wing, they had the Vodafone branding. And right where the F is in Vodafone, this hole was. Therefore, this system was known as the F-duct, in homage to the Vodafone branding on the McLaren. The Red Bull and the Ferrari and the Renault, and later on the Sauber, which was technically called the BMW Sauber in this era, though BMW had nothing to do with the team any longer, they also copied the F-duct. So Red Bull, by this point, and this car is a late season variant of the RB6, they were running their own F-duct. What was going on with the F-duct? Well, you can see obviously that we have got a discharge here, just an aerodynamic vent here, this upper aperture there that you can see, that is part of the F-duct. And when the F-duct was closed, in other words, when the F-duct system is not operating, it's just venting its air there, and it's going to direct it through the gap between the main plane of the rear wing and the beam wing. Fine. However, when the driver decided to move his, in the case of the Red Bull, his left hand into the side of the cockpit bulkhead, he would cover up an aperture in the cockpit as well, which was there for cockpit cooling officially. However, if the driver decided to move the backside of his hand over this aperture in the cockpit, he would activate a pressure switch effectively. There was no mechanical switch. He was just manipulating the airflow through this duct, which would cease the air exiting through this aperture here, and it would then redirect the air to exit into the main plane of the rear wing. When this happened, it created destructive interference in the flow that was going through the rear wing main plane, and that would stall the rear wing. In other words, it would stop the rear wing from generating nearly as much downforce as it would otherwise. When this happened, you also reduced significantly the amount of drag that the car was producing. This means that you're going to get greater top speed at the expense of overall downforce. So in effect, what was happening here, and again, completely organic, in this case initially discovered by McLaren and then promptly copied by the other teams, they were producing DRS before DRS was a thing. And this idea, this system, this way of reducing rear downforce was the genesis of DRS on the part of the FIA, because in order to operate this system, the drivers, depending on how the teams had it configured, the drivers either had to move one of their arms or move one of their legs. And this meant, in the case of the arm-operated systems, removing a hand from the steering wheel in most cases. The FIA, in their infinite wisdom, said that the greatest drivers in the world are incapable of operating a Grand Prix car with just one hand on the steering wheel. Therefore, by the end of the 2010 season, the FIA elected to ban any sort of aerodynamic device that was operated by the driver that involved him having to release his grip on the steering wheel. As a compromise, though, they said, well, you're stalling the rear wings. So effectively, you're basically removing the rear wing main plane to a large extent when you're using this system. So as a compromise, why don't we just give you an active rear wing? Let's give you the ability to open up the slot gap in your rear wing, so effectively you're going to have that F-duct effect without any of the F-duct architecture. And that's exactly what they did. So for 2011, DRS, the drag reduction system, became a thing in Formula One. And we still have it to this day, and it still works in exactly that principle. We're going to open up a slot gap in the main plane of the rear wing, and we're going to reduce drag thereby. So the F-duct system, which was an interesting way of using the available real estate on the car to do very cool things with the aerodynamics, basically, that innovation caused the FIA to have to fold and say, okay, you found something cool, we're going to use this in subsequent seasons, but we're going to operate this in a slightly different way. So DRS was born out of the F-duct, and the RB6 was one of the cars that used the F-duct system to great effect. However, going down to more conventional things on the rear end here, we've got our diffuser, as you can see. It's a double-level diffuser, or you can even say maybe a triple-level diffuser, depending on how you want to look at this. Obviously, we have got our strakes coming from the top of the floor down toward the ground. We've got our central channel here underneath the rear crash structure, and then, of course, we have got the area above the diffuser here. However, we also have a central tunnel, which is in this section here, you can see. So we've got energized air coming from underneath the car, around the sides, around the inboard side of the rear tires, and then we have energized air via the exhaust coming in through the center section. So all of this is conspiring to create a lot of downforce on RB6, and really, Sebastian Vettel, in his driving style, he really keyed into having a lot of rear stability. And he was able to just pivot the car as if the rear end were a fulcrum because he was so confident in that the rear end will stick no matter what he does to it, basically. And he was able to do that because of the great aerodynamic design work of Adrian Newey and co., beginning here really on the Red Bull RB5, where they started to use this diffuser design. They had the side exhaust, or really the centerline exhaust, beginning on the RB5, but it started to come to fruition really on the RB6. And of course, similar designs would follow thereafter on RB7, RB8, and RB9 to the end of the V8 era. But it all started on RB5, and it came to maturity on the RB6 as we see it here. Additionally here, detail-wise though, what else we can see? The yellow structure you can see coming down vertically from the rear crash structure, that's a tow hook. And then the yellow circle that you can see basically in the center line of the diffuser, that's to represent where the starter hole would be to start the car. So that is real cool. Additionally, of course, you can see the rear axle with our rear wheels, and then some of our rear brake duct assembly. That's really, really cool. I like all of that. Certainly do. I like all of that immensely. Coming around here on the left side of the car, rather, really we're not going to see anything different on the left side as we did on the right side, just a continuation thereof, and showing it for continuity's sake. But all the same details that we saw on the right side are now here on the left. And yes, basically the only difference here between the right and left sides is the branding on the rear wing end fence. We've got just the generic Red Bull can here on the left end fence, and we got the Red Bull Cola on the right end fence. But other than that, all the same detail here evident. Very cool stuff, and just very nicely modeled here by Mini Chaps. I like all of that immensely. The car has a very nice presence here, and I do like overall the proportion of the car because of the shark fin. The shark fin made these cars a bit more tolerable to look at here in terms of aesthetics, in my opinion. Once they got rid of the shark fins and you just had a gap here between what was then a sloped engine cover and then the rear wing, it kind of created some dead space on the car, and I didn't like the proportion of that as much. But when we had the shark fins on these cars, I think they looked their best. This era was a bit aesthetically challenged in terms of the overall configuration of the cars, in my opinion. But when we had the shark fins, they looked better. Too bad we lost them. And it was too bad that we lost them again after 2017 as well. But Formula One fans can be fickle. And when Twitter became a thing, they said shark fins are ugly, so we haven't had shark fins since. Great loss to the aesthetics of Formula One cars, in my opinion. Now picking up freehand, and we'll just get in a little bit more closely on some of the finer details on the car here, and talk about it as the model that it is, really. First of all, on the front wing, we talked about all the cascade elements that the teams were playing with in this era, and here they are. You can now see them a bit more clearly, and you can see complexity starting to come back in on these Formula One wings. 2009, they were all pretty much not all that inventive in terms of what the teams were able to do, because it was the first year for these regulations. It was the first time that they made a wing like this, and they weren't quite up to speed with all of the different design possibilities that existed. But here in 2010, the regulations beginning to start to find some maturity, so the teams were starting to get a little bit less shy about exploiting little hacks that they were finding in the regulations. So all of that is cool. Center section of the wing here with two little camera mounts here. Camera mount blanks in this case, but cameras could be run there. They would be rear-facing cameras in all likelihood to take a look at the center line of the car. And then below that we have Make Roads Safe here. This was something that the FIA was starting. This was the precursors to the FIA campaign for road safety or something like that, whatever they call it. But you can see this decal here on that center section of the wing. The campaign for global road safety. Yes. Formula One cars, they have a lot to do with road safety, don't they? No, they don't. They have nothing to do with road cars at all. Stop trying to say that they're road relevant. They're not. However, great detail here is in terms of the decal work on the nose cone. We've got a Renault logo, a Red Bull Racing logo, And of course, we've got a representation of an air intake there for cockpit cooling, as well as starting to feed the F-duct system. The other winglet here on the main plane and front wing. Cool, like all of that. There's our front suspension, and this is the right front wheel with our brake duct and our front suspension, wishbone push rod, real cool. And then the front end of the monocoque here with our pitot array, our antenna, and our fairings over the dampers, and creating that aerodynamic channel leading toward the cockpit. So all of that is really cool, like all of that. Nice detail throughout, though, on the decal work, and the paint looks really nice as well. Obviously a little bit of dust on the model, because it's been out for a few hours, and of course I've had this one since the end of 2010, so this model is now 12 years old, but I must say it has held up very, very nicely over the years. Of course, it lives in its box, and I don't take this one out all that much, but it's survived quite nicely, and I like it, I really do. There's the center section of the front end with our barge board and our turning vane. And then through here, can we see? Yep, there we go. There's our cape winglet right there. Quite nice, like all of that. And then inside we have our side pods and radiators. No attempt at a radiator matrix, just a flat panel of die-cast metal, but obviously the side pods are three-dimensional. There's a duct inside, at very least, so nice compromise on that. And then, of course, inside the cockpit, there is Sebastian Vettel. His helmet, this is the Abu Dhabi spec helmet, so he would have worn this in the last race of the season when he won his world championship. And the cameras facing into the cockpit, they got great views of that helmet as it was sparkling in the nighttime floodlights there at Abu Dhabi. Real cool, and has that shimmering effect here on the model. Like all of that immensely, looking into the cockpit, we can see some details here in the cockpit. We have an FIA homologation plaque in there if we'll focus on it. Starting to get there, yep. Homologation plaque, that all looks nice. Track map of Abu Dhabi as well. And a steering wheel, which looks quite nice. Additionally, you can see some seatbelt detail in there, and of course all of the decals for sponsors on the driver's suit itself. Looks really, really nice. The seatbelts there, they're just decals. They're not modeled in 3 dimensions at all, but obviously you can tell what they are, and they're there. So good effort there on the part of Mini Champs to do that. Additionally, on the back side of the steering wheel, you can see we have an attempt at rendering the shift and clutch paddles. So all of that is real cool. Along the sides of the cockpit, you can see Vettel, S. Vettel, of course, driver's name there, Wings for Life charity organization there that was set up by Red Bull. I believe it's still active. And of course, the marshalling clutch there, that is the emergency neutral switch. So if the car loses power, it obviously loses hydraulic pressure and therefore loses gear shift. So if you need to get this car out of the way and it's stuck in gear, you hit that, and then it would be popped into neutral, and you've got yourself the ability to roll the car away. Real cool, and I like the added details there, and in particular I like the added detail of the homologation sticker and the Abu Dhabi track map, so that looks really cool. I like all of that. Additionally, though, we've got our intake for the engine here, our T-bar camera mount, and then of course our shark fin. Decal is kind of breaking up a little bit there, but we can pardon that. And then the length of the shark fin interfacing with the rear wing main plane there. The big end fences on the rear wing in this era. And then the rear zone of the car. The top side of the side pods leading directly into the top side of the diffuser with our double wishbone pull rod rear suspension. And then right below the lower wishbone of the rear suspension, that little indentation, that is your engine exhaust outlet for the left bank. So right there you can see where the exhaust is going to be routed right into the center line of the diffuser through there. Real cool. Additionally, the side of the floor there, your barge board and turning vane, and then your leading edge of the floor, which then extends all the way down the side of the car. I like the carbon texturing that's visible throughout. A little bit of a checkerboard pattern with the carbon texturing, that's nice. This little raised blister area, that is either a camera or an infrared temperature sensor just trying to monitor temperature of the rear tires. And then of course the rear zone, once again, with their engine cover with the air outlet for your gearbox radiator. Real cool. Your rear wheel and tire assembly once again. OZ Racing decal there on the inner flange of that wheel. Looks real nice. Definitely like it. Taking another look inside the cockpit, this time from the right side of the car, and here you can see we have yet more detail. First of all, we have got that wonderfully reflective, shimmery helmet of Sebastian Vettel there, with the reflection of the intake snorkel visible inside. So that's cool. That's something that you saw on the TV coverage, so really cool to see that they actually emulated the reflectivity of the helmet as well with that foil. But in addition, you can see the steering wheel detail itself. That's real cool. And you can see we've got a dashboard here, reading all balls, all zeros here, but you can see shift lights, other status lights, and obviously a representation of the LCD unit that would be giving critical information about what the car is doing. That's nice. We'll drop our light here for a moment, and we'll just show you that the steering is operable. There we go. The steering wheel doesn't deflect all that much, but as I turn the front wheel here manually, we do get a deflection in the steering wheel. So obviously that does kind of work, which is really cool. And it was something that I was actually somewhat disappointed with the 2009 Mini Champs Formula One models. We didn't have operable steering on most, if any, of those cars. I've only got one of them, but we didn't have operable steering. And I think it's a detail that means something. It's also something I'm disappointed to see on subsequent 2018 through 2020 Mini Champs cars, the few of those that I have. So again, I like the operable steering. It's a detail that just adds a little something. If we don't have it, it's not a deal breaker, but again, it's something that I appreciate, and it's something that I very much want on model Formula One cars. However, right side of the engine cover here, taking a look at that F-duct fairing, then the interface with the rear wing main plane, cool. And then the side pods once again with more details with the carbon look. That looks really nice. Seeing a little bit by eye, a little bit of a moire effect. If I take a look, if I move my head around, I can see depth in this little roughly triangular section of carbon. And yeah, you're getting it here too as I move my light around, and as I move the camera around, you can see that we can get that same moire effect with just the depth that's going on with that carbon interfacing with the decal there. It's kind of cool. I like that. There is our exhaust outlet here for the right bank, and then our lower wishbone there for the rear suspension. Real nice. Moving forward there on the side pod. I like that geometry there with the upper area of the side pod where the radiator inlet is, then as that curves inboard toward the floor. Definitely like that. Again, is the attention to detail in designs like this, and then in the execution of a model like this where Mini Champs earned their money when they made this one. Looks good. From the rear zone of the cape winglets there underneath the nose. Really nice. And of course your wing mirrors, your cockpit surround. Very nice. Very nice indeed. Definitely like that. The car, in general, as the 1/18th scale model that it is, it has a very nice presence. It's pretty weighty in terms of its construction. It is mostly die-cast. Of course, the shark fin and the front and rear wings, they're in plastic. The suspension elements and diffuser are also in plastic. But the main structure of the car is die-cast, and therefore it's reasonably heavy, and it's held up very nicely. Again, this one is currently 12 years old as a real car as well as a model here in my collection, and it's survived quite nicely through then with 12 solar laps with the seasonal changes here in the northeastern United States, getting hot in the summer and cold in the winter, so sometimes that's not good for decals and paint, but this one has held up very nicely. So all in all, very pleased with what we see going on here on the RB6.
So there it was in 1/18th scale by Mini Champs, Sebastian Vettel's 2010 Red Bull RB6. Of course, the first car with which Sebastian Vettel triumphed in the Formula One World Drivers' Championship, and the first car that triumphed in the Formula One World Constructors' Championship for Red Bull Racing. Of course, Red Bull would go on to win the Constructors' Championship 3 more times in this era, in 2011, 2012, and 2013. After that, though, the 2014 technical regulation shakeup, bringing in the 1.6-liter turbo hybrid powertrains, taking away all of that rear downforce that Sebastian Vettel really enjoyed in his driving style and taking away a lot of the potential for downforce generation that Adrian Newey exploited to such great effect in this era. Red Bull entered a bit of a lean period. However, they did manage to win a few races here and there, courtesy of Daniel Ricciardo and Max Verstappen beginning in the 2016 season, and they slowly have been on an upward trajectory ever since. This, to date, has culminated in Max Verstappen winning the Formula One Drivers' World Championship in 2021, Red Bull's first championship triumph since 2013 with Sebastian Vettel. However, that Constructors' Championship has remained elusive since 2022. However, another technical regulation shakeup. Adrian Newey still on staff with Red Bull Racing. Max Verstappen is in the form of his life. And Red Bull evidently have gotten their interpretation quite correct in the 2022 technical regulations, with a fundamental change in the way that these cars are working, now very heavily reliant upon ground effect to generate the vast majority of their downforce. And they have had a bit of a fight from Ferrari. However, Ferrari have been faltering right at the top of their game, right when they get the opportunity to score big points in a race. Whether it's strategy call mistakes, or we've got problems in pit stops, or we've got problems on the driver's side, Ferrari not really, to date, able to put up a consistent challenge to Red Bull Racing. So for 2022, it does appear that Red Bull Racing will be winning the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships once again. It'd be the second Drivers' title for Max Verstappen, and it would be the fifth Constructors' title for Red Bull Racing. But Red Bull made it to the top of the world for the first time back in 2010 with this very car right here, the 2010 Red Bull RB6. Fundamentally different from what we're seeing in Formula One nowadays, but it was the car that launched the, quite honestly, the legend that will be Red Bull Racing. One day when Red Bull decide that their Formula One program is no longer the direction that they wish to take their company, and they decide to pull the plug on this, when we look back on the history of Red Bull's contribution in Formula One, undoubtedly we will be mentioning the RB6, Sebastian Vettel, and that run of 4 straight Drivers' and Constructors' Championships from 2010 through 2013. A legend came to maturity in 2010 with this very car, the Red Bull RB6, and now the career of its driver, Sebastian Vettel, does appear to be coming to a close, with the German announcing his retirement at the end of 2022. But we do look back on these days fondly when we consider the career of Sebastian Vettel, and this is the car with which he began to write his Formula One career legacy. Until next time, though, I do hope that all of you have enjoyed this look at the Red Bull RB6 in 1/18th scale. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you all very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.